Okay, ready to dive into a study that's both fascinating and kind of unsettling.
I'm game if you are.
So picture this. You're at Yale,
Mhm.
right? You signed up for a memory study, even getting paid for it. Seems straightforward enough.
Yeah, sounds pretty standard. Until it takes a very unexpected turn.
Exactly. Because next thing you know, you're being told to zap another person with an electric shock every time they mess up on a question.
And not just like a little jolt.
No. We're talking shocks that go all the way up to 450 volts. Yeah, I mean, that's got to give anyone pause, don't you think?
Absolutely. This was the actual setup in Stanley Milgram's famous obedience study back in 1963. And let me tell you, the results were something else.
Okay, hold on. We've got to unpack those results in a sec. But first, how did this experiment even work?
Right, right. Well, I've been digging into Milgram's research, and it's wild.
Hit me with it.
Okay, so Milgram, he recruits 40 everyday guys, teachers, salesmen, you name it.
Regular Joes.
Exactly. For what they think is just this learning and memory study happening to be at Yale.
Okay, Yale University. I feel like that detail is important already.
Oh, it's huge. The setting itself, the whole authority of Yale, it's all baked into the experiment's design. So anyway, these guys show up and they're told they'll be randomly assigned as either the teacher or the learner.
Right, standard procedure.
Except, of course, it's rigged. The real participant is always the teacher. The learner is actually an actor pretending to be another volunteer.
Oh, sneaky. So we've got our unsuspecting teacher ready to help this guy learn some word pairs.
Right.
And then there's the learner strapped into what looks like a very real, very serious electric chair.
Oh, yeah. They spared no expense on the theatrics. And to make it even more convincing, there's this shock generator.
Not just some rinky-dink thing, right?
No way. This thing had 30 switches on it, each with a clear voltage label. From slate shock all the way to, get this, danger, severe shock.
Talk about setting the mood.
Right. Milgram wanted to make sure it felt authentic. And to really drive it home, they even gave the participants a sample shock of 45 volts.
Ouch. Can't imagine they were too keen on that part.
You think? But it all added to the realism.
So the big question is, knowing the shock seemed real, did anyone actually go all the way? Like, seriously?
You'd think people would draw the line at some point. Right. Refuse to go on even if someone in charge was telling them to.
Exactly.
Well, even Milgram himself thought so. Before they started, he asked some Yale psych students to predict what would happen.
Oh, interesting. What'd they say?
Most of them figured less than 3% would actually deliver the maximum voltage.
3%. Talk about an underestimate. Okay, so what happened when the learner started making mistakes and those shocks kept getting stronger?
Well, this is where it gets really interesting. And by interesting, I mean kind of messed up. Every single participant, all 40 of them, administered shocks up to 300 volts.
300 volts?
Okay.
That's insane. And that's the point where the learner starts pounding on the wall, right? Like, clearly freaking out. Did anyone stop there?
Sadly, no. A full 26 out of 40, that's 65% of the participants, continued all the way to 450 volts.
65%. That number is unbelievable. Like, it goes against everything we think we know about basic human decency. How could so many people deliver what they thought were potentially lethal shocks?
That is the million-dollar question. It's what makes Milgram's experiment so important and so disturbing. It reveals something profound about how easily we can be influenced by authority, even when it clashes with our morals.
So, what were the factors at play here? What made these regular people so obedient?
Milgram identified a few crucial elements that help explain what happened. And unpacking those, well, it might make you question a few things about human nature.
So these are just average people, right? At Yale, told they're contributing to this big, important scientific study.
Right.
That's got to create some pressure to perform.
Yeah.
Like, you don't want to mess up the science, right?
Oh, absolutely. And Milgram was very deliberate in how he set things up. I mean, this was Yale University. We're talking about a place that just oozes prestige and authority.
Right. Like, who are you to question a Yale scientist in a lab coat?
Exactly. And it's not even just about the person. It's also this idea that you're contributing to something bigger than yourself, right? The advancement of science.
Like, I better not screw this up. This is important research we're doing here.
Exactly. And on top of all that, these participants, they weren't forced into this. They volunteered. And they were being paid for their time, which I think really adds to this sense of obligation.
Like, I made a commitment. I got to see this through.
Exactly.
Okay, yeah, I'm starting to see how all these factors kind of build on each other, like a perfect storm of obedience. But I'm curious, was there anything about the actual design of the experiment itself, the way it was structured, that might have made people more inclined to obey?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, that's part of what makes Milgram's work so brilliant, really. He understood how subtle details could influence behavior. For example, think about how the shocks were increased. Each time, it was just 15 volts higher than the last.
So it's like this gradual thing, this slow escalation. You almost don't realize how strong it's getting.
Precisely. By the time the learner starts really protesting, yelling, and banging on the wall, those participants, they'd already given several shocks. They were already in pretty deep.
It's like, what's one more shock at that point?
Exactly. And to make things even more intense, the whole thing took place in this closed off room, no contact with the outside world, no time to really think things through, just the participant, the experimenter telling them what to do, and the learner getting more and more distressed.
Man, talk about pressure. No wonder people found it hard to stand up to the experimenter.
Right. And then, get this, there's one more detail that really adds to this whole thing. Milgram made sure the experimenter kept telling the participants that the shocks, while painful, were not dangerous.
Oh, wow. I hadn't thought of that. So even if they felt conflicted about it, there's this authority figure assuring them that no real harm was being done.
Exactly. So even if they had doubts, they were being told it was fine. It's powerful stuff.
It's amazing how much our brains want to believe authority figures, even when something feels off.
It really is. And that's what I think is so unsettling about Milgram's findings. It shows how easily we can rationalize our behavior, even when it goes against what we know is right, especially when we're told it serves a greater good or we're just following orders.
It's a scary thought, honestly. The good people are capable of doing bad things when they're caught in the wrong situation. It's kind of
Yeah.
wild, right? That just being told those shocks are painful, but they're not dangerous, could have such a big impact on how people acted.
Yeah, it really shows you how much we're wired to trust authority figures. I mean, think about it. From the time we're little, we're taught to respect authority, to believe they know what's best.
And most of the time, they do. But like you said, Milgram's experiment really shows how that trust can be manipulated, how it can lead us to make decisions that go against our own moral compass.
Absolutely.
So how do we fix that? How do we balance respecting authority with, actually thinking for ourselves and doing the right thing, even when it's hard?
That's the million-dollar question. There's no easy answer. But I do think Milgram's research gives us some good clues. Like, first off, it shows just how important self-awareness really is. We got to recognize that anyone can be influenced. Even if we think we're too smart or too strong-willed.
It's not about saying, I'd never do that. It's more like acknowledging that we're all capable of being swayed under the right circumstances.
Exactly. And that awareness should make us more skeptical, more likely to question authority, especially if something doesn't feel right.
Which is easier said than done, right? Like, questioning authority can be scary, even when you know you should.
Totally. It takes guts to speak up, to rock the boat, but it's so important to remember that real authority shouldn't be afraid of questions. It should welcome them.
That's a good point. Like, if someone in charge is trying to shut down questions or dissent, red flag.
Big time. Blind obedience helps no one. It's by asking tough questions and actually disagreeing respectfully that we hold those in power accountable, and that's how we create a better, more ethical world.
Couldn't agree more. So if there's one big takeaway you want our listeners to walk away with from this deep dive into Milgram's experiment, what would it be?
Don't underestimate your own capacity for obedience, both for good and bad. We all have it in us to be influenced by authority figures, to do things that go against our values. But the more we understand about how these dynamics work, the more we cultivate critical thinking skills, trust our gut when something feels off, the more we can become conscious, empowered decision makers, both in our own lives and in the world.
Love that. Awareness, critical thinking, trusting your gut. Those are tools we can all use. Well, this has been a fascinating conversation, to say the least. Really makes you think. Expert speaker, thanks for breaking all this down for us.
Happy to be here. Always love a good deep dive into these topics.
And to our listeners, thank you so much for joining us on this exploration of obedience. Knowledge is power. And the more we understand about ourselves, the better equipped we are to navigate all the complexities out there. Until next time, keep asking questions, keep challenging what you think you know, and as always, keep diving deep.